today we have the executive director of Kids Gardening, M. Shipman, that's going to discuss a little bit about kids gardening and their organization with us today. So, M, the first question I had, and this is kind of the most basic, is, why do you think gardening is so important for kids and students, and what are some of the benefits?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think gardening is beneficial for everyone, but I think, especially beneficial for kids. And we try to work with the adults in children's lives, so educators and caregivers, to support them to get more kids learning and growing through the garden. Because gardening is really a regulating activity for kids. And so, what do I mean by regulating? Well, when we go outside, and that's typically where we do most of our gardening, but when we interact with plants more generally, it's calming to our bodies. There's a lot of data that suggests that working with plants, caring for plants, and being outside gives us all of sort of the sensory input that we need. Not too much and not too little, sort of just the appropriate amount of sensory input that we need. So it's not overwhelming, like perhaps being in a crowded, noisy cafeteria at school might be, or on a noisy playground. And it's not sort of the sensory deprivation that being in a classroom with, doing your standardized tests might be, where everything has to be quiet and you have to sit still and not talk and not wiggle. So schools can often be too much or too little for some youth. And we find that gardens are really wonderful places for kids to get their sensory needs met, calm their minds and bodies, and establish sort of that baseline well-being that's needed in order to be able to learn. And then from there, the stage is set for learning, right? And then the garden can act as a sort of a laboratory in a way, just like you have a science lab in the school. The garden is a living laboratory for learning. And it's a wonderful place to see cause and effect, to see as a plant's leaves wilt and then we water it, those leaves can perk up again, so you can see the impact directly of your actions on that plant. We can make hypotheses about, well, if I trim the leaves off this plant, will it grow new leaves in these spots or in this other spot? We can practice the scientific method, and really the stakes are quite low for making mistakes, quote unquote, so
Sure.
you've probably heard people talk about something called growth mindset, and it's the idea that we learn from our mistakes, and we talk about mistakes as learning opportunities, right? Almost like there is no such thing as a mistake, and that's totally true for gardening. We just try new things. We just look at everything we do in the garden as an opportunity to explore what works and what doesn't, and potentially do something differently the next time, depending on what the outcomes are that we're looking for. So we really find the garden an excellent place to teach science. You can teach math for sure through the garden. Kids Gardening has developed a book called Math in the Garden. We have a curriculum called Books in Bloom to teach literacy through the garden. You can absolutely teach about culture and diversity and different cultures, history with botany and horticulture and plants and food, of course, as well. So any subject can be taught through the garden, and it's just a really engaging and regulating space for kids to be learning, as opposed to sitting still, in chairs at desks all day. So it's good for kids, and we think that what's good for kids is good for communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes sense. I mean, you kind of referred there at the end to an alternative to kids sitting in classrooms. And so when we talk about, this is more of a digital age, what are some ways to engage kids and actually get them excited about being outside and getting dirty and, not prefer just being inside on some sort of screen or doing something indoors?
Yeah. Well, surprisingly, it doesn't usually take a lot. So I think in schools, kids are typically eager to get outside, get out of the classroom, move their bodies. And so it's less of an issue there. But I mean, I'm a mom of two kids, and sometimes my oldest, who's 6, it's like, I don't want to go outside. There's more fun stuff to do inside. But as soon as we get out there and we start digging around, um, he's into it and he wants to stay out there for hours. So it does take a little bit of prodding. And one good way, as with anything in parenting, um, to bribe him is food. So we grow really yummy food in the garden. We grow these snacking cucumbers. The variety is called Diva. I think they were an All-American selection last year. We grow lunchbox peppers. Those are small snacking variety too. It's really fun to just like grab sugar snap peas off of the vine, or of course berries are great. So letting kids just roam around the garden snacking. I would say probably half of the produce that we grow doesn't even make it into the house. And that's great because I love to garden. And so just having my kids out in the garden snacking gives me more time to myself to do what I love to do. And I'm sure there are lots of parents listening who, have things they want to get done outside. And the garden is actually a great place to distract kids and allow them to play. But one other idea I have for you is to create play spaces in the garden and sensory spaces. So you can create sensory spaces with having tools for digging in the dirt and reserving a little patch for kids to play and dig. So touching soil, playing with seeds, feeling soft leaves or prickly leaves. Those are all sensory things kids can do in the garden.
Mhm.
That's especially, I think, important for the younger kids. And then for older kids, creating forts. So it can be really fun to create sunflower houses or bean forts. So putting stakes like bamboo poles into a sort of quote unquote teepee formation and then growing beans up those, or growing sunflowers in a ring. And then kids can hang out in there and read books or play, and it's their own little secret space. So those are just a couple ways to lure kids out into the garden. But, ownership is a good one too. Having a little piece of the garden that belongs to them that they can tend and grow whatever they want is a good way to get them engaged.
Yeah, those are some great ideas. I know I have a 5 and a 7-year-old, so anytime you can mix snacking with an activity, that's certainly going to pique their attention.
Yeah, totally. And when you don't have to go back inside to get the snacks, it's easier to stay out longer. I feel like that's always what derails us when someone needs to go back inside for something, and then the kids don't want to go back out. So you can
Yeah.
just have everything you need out there.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's great. Kind of transitioning to like, gardening for a school or an organization. Let's say when schools, have zero history of gardening instruction or teaching or really any knowledge, what's the best way to get started? What's the first step you recommend a school or organization take when they want to introduce gardening?
Well, go to kidsgardening.org. That's our website. There's a getting started section, and we have all kinds of resources for folks on how to get started. But I guess I would say the first thing, like if you're an educator listening and you are excited about gardening and you want to start gardening at your school with your students, the first thing you should do is find some colleagues who are also excited about it. Don't
Hmm.
try to do it alone. You will, I don't mean to sound pessimistic, but it's likely that you'll burn out quickly. It's a lot of work, right? So find some colleagues that want to do it with you and start a committee. Maybe recruit a parent, recruit somebody that's part of buildings and grounds, recruit somebody that is maybe on the school board or part of the administration or part of the PTO, and even some students if you have some older students. So, sort of a diverse group of stakeholders to be part of your committee, and then get a sense of what kind of garden would be most enjoyed at your school, and then try to get some buy-in from the administration and get that going. And of course, you're going to need some money to do that. And Kids Gardening has about 5 different grant opportunities throughout the course of the year that folks can apply to get, just small amounts of money needed to get a garden started. So it doesn't take a lot. You can start with $500, $2,500. Start small. Don't build some giant, kitchen garden or something like series of raised beds to get started. Start small and see how it goes and see what you like and what works and what doesn't, and go from there. And we really encourage people to start with container gardening for the most part, because you can control a lot of the variables more easily that way. So controlling sort of the quality of the soil, controlling the location. And it's sometimes too easier to get buy-in from buildings and grounds or administration on placement of these gardens if they know that those are raised beds and they can be moved if needed. Or even containers, right? Like even a collection of 5-gallon buckets can work well to get started. So start small and go from there. And there are definitely lots of resources on our website to guide people in getting going.
Yeah, that's great. Those are some good tips. I did see in 2020 that Kids Gardening awarded somewhere around $160,000 in grants. Can you talk about or highlight a few of those, grants that were given and maybe some of the impacts they're having?
Sure, yeah, I would love to. One program comes to mind because it was really touching for me. A school in California, actually a club at a high school. So this was entirely led by high school students. They went out and collected, I think around something like 200 acorns from, I'm not going to remember exactly the kind of oak, but a really important kind of oak for their community and their ecosystem. And then they soaked those oaks and they planted them, and they did all of this entire project with materials that they found or reused from their school. So they didn't purchase anything and they didn't create any new waste. But I think they used milk cartons to plant these oaks, and they grew them to seedlings, and then they used them as part of a reforestation project and a carbon sequestration project. So it was really community building. It was, it had environmental conservation focus as well, and it was entirely student-led, and they did it with little to no resources. And I was just really impressed by the young woman who wrote in to tell us about the project, and we were really thrilled to be able to support them in doing that. I think this year has been so difficult for, I guess, year and a half for so many people, and it's really nice to see gardens and youth gardens especially bringing people together and giving people a sense of sort of empowerment and agency in this time where we're all feeling a little bit of a loss of control. Gardens are really, I think, community building, and to see youth sort of leading that for me is really, really hopeful. So similarly, we had some projects that we funded where youth were growing food for their local food shelves and meal sites. I think when the pandemic first hit, before the government was really doing much financial relief for folks, people were, we all know people were having a really hard time financially, and some people still are. But food shelves and meal sites were more important than they had been in decades. And a lot of the garden programs that we funded this past year were at the forefront of providing fresh produce to those meal sites, and food shelves. And I really think that's beautiful for youth to be able to feel like they can do something to help.
Yeah, no, that's a really cool application of kind of something that allows kids to learn and grow and also take like a leadership
Yeah.
stance in their community. So that's really interesting. So, typically when I think of school gardens, I think of, elementary schools and young kids, but I think you highlighted that there's also kind of opportunity for everyone from pre-K up through, secondary education to kind of get involved in at different levels of gardening. So can you talk a little bit about how that maybe changes when you're talking about introducing someone in pre-K, a 4 or 5 year old, to gardening, and how their interactions look versus maybe someone who's a senior in high school?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really important. I think in general, when we're gardening with kids, it's really important to align our expectations with their developmental stage and their developmental readiness. So really with young kids, pre-K, and you can be with infants out in the garden too, for sure. It's just about exposure at that age. It's really just about building early positive associations with nature and the garden, and a lot of those sensory experiences that I talked about earlier are really important. So I remember with my son when he was under a year, I would just give him, little cups of seeds to feel and play with his tiny little fingers. And um, both, I can distinctly remember both of my sons the first time they like really dug their hands into the dirt. We have raised beds, and they, it was sort of like a baptism of sorts, like just getting in there and getting dirty. And that's important. And smelling flowers and feeling leaves. So for little kids, it's really about that exposure, and having water around for play as well. And then as kids get older, you can kind of get more structured and provide more direction. And I also like to, you know, often people are using garden-based learning as a way of teaching about environmental issues as well, and sometimes threats to habitat, or, you know, talking about climate change, or using the garden to, to inform kids of some environmental issues. But I like to encourage educators and parents to, wait to talk about some of the bigger, scarier issues until kids are a bit older and able to do something about those issues. And so I think as kids get older, we're providing more direction and instruction and structure, and we're exposing them to, more advanced concepts and more advanced sort of issues that might be going on in the broader environment. But pollinators are a really good place to start when kids are in elementary school, and then you can build on that as they grow, to then talk about, what's going on with bees, and then eventually it can grow out to our food system, and then you can talk about migrant labor, or you could talk about organic agriculture. So it's sort of never ending. You can take the same theme, and you can start small with just the bee itself and the
Mhm.
pollination and the pollen baskets on the hind legs, and you can go from just the botany of it all the way out to, like I said, food systems, right? Because that's how
Yeah.
we get a lot of our food. So that's the exciting part about garden-based learning, is like when kids are little, you just are focused on the micro aspects, and then as they get larger, you can sort of zoom out.
Yeah, yeah, I can see how that, gardening it touches so many different areas of our world, whether it be scientific or social or different things. So sounds like there's a lot of different directions you can really go when trying to apply it or teach your kids.
Yeah,
That's
there
great.
are
That's
so
great.
many. It's endless.
Yeah. So one other thing that we've seen kind of an increase in interest in really is more of like the hydroponic side of things. So I'm curious, like, is that something that you see has similar value to kids, and where do you, I mean, how would you recommend, if that is, getting kids started and learning about how that works, similar to kind of soil gardening?
Yeah, we have developed a lot of resources around hydroponics, and we think it's a great learning opportunity for kids. It's also really just, I haven't touched on this very much. It's really accessible because it can be done indoors. And, similar to growing under lights, a lot of schools don't have space to garden outdoors. A lot of teachers may not have the time to go in and outdoors. So, we have a program called Grow Lab that we developed that's gardening under lights. We've worked with the National Farm to School Network around hydroponics as well and have developed some resources for that. And, I will say that our resources are really designed to be relatively low cost and low investment, which is nice as a starting point. As I mentioned, start small and then see what the interest is and go from there. Um, Hydroponics is great for teaching all of the STEM or STEAM subjects, right? So science, technology, engineering, and math. And it can even be done with younger kids. You just need to adapt it to be, a little bit less complex. And some of the work would be done for them, or you would use some of the, ready-made systems. We have instructions in some of the guides that we've put together for how to build your own systems, but you're not going to do that with pre-K or kindergarten or even maybe
Right.
first and second grade. But still, there's a lot of learning that can occur just through the observation. So hydroponics for sure is a valuable teaching tool. There's a lot that students can learn from those systems and from just observing um, the plants up close. I think oftentimes when kids are up close and personal with plants on a day-to-day basis indoors, they notice more if they're walking by it a few times a day versus seeing it out in the garden once or twice a week. So that's a benefit as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that you touched on accessibility. One thing we see a lot is either people individually in their homes or educators at schools with limited space. But it sounds like there's a lot of opportunities even for those that don't have plots of land or even space for a raised bed. There's a lot of options out there to get started on a much smaller level, even in kind of a limited space environment.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, cool. Well, so I think you already told us kidsgardening.org. There's a lot of getting started materials. Is there anything else you would recommend for people to kind of connect to your organization and learn more?
Well, we're online at Kids Gardening. Facebook and Pinterest is actually a great place to get some activities to do. We're on Instagram as well. And something to mention is that we have recently launched an online community for anyone who gardens with kids, and it's community.kidsgardening.org. It's called the Kids Garden Community. And you can go there and create a quick profile to say, what you're interested in terms of gardening with youth, and connect with other like-minded people. And you can just ask people questions directly to say, like, hey, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm looking for, a local place to donate mulch. Like, who knows where I can get mulch, or who has ideas for how to garden with preschooler, like how to do hydroponics with preschoolers. And there will be other people in the community who will have those experiences who can chime in and answer you. And you
Yeah.
can also learn about grants there, funding opportunities, events, different curricular resources that you can do and activities that you can do. So it's sort of a clearinghouse for anything related to gardening with kids and a way to meet like-minded people who are doing the same kind of work.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, that seems like a very valuable resource for people who maybe are overwhelmed by the idea of getting started. So that seems like a very, very useful tool there.
Yeah, it's always
Um,
nice to have somebody you can just, ask questions to. So.
yeah, yeah. Well, great. And this is all extremely valuable information. Anything else you want to leave us with today, or do you think we've covered most of what you'd like to communicate?
Yeah, we've covered most of it. I would just encourage people to get started. Start small, but get started. You'll be glad you did. It's just so rewarding to garden with kids.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Adam.